Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Religious Studies Project. My name is Gandalf the Grey, and I'm joined by Saruman the White.
I fear your love of the halfling sweet has dulled your mind, Chris.
Oh, has it, David? We are Chris Carter and David Robertson, your ever faithful, ever ridiculous Religious Studies Project
We are
the hosts.
The two towers of the Religious Studies Project.
Oh, I like it. This has no bearing on the interview at all, which is an interview that Ben Marcus recorded with Robert Jones on America's changing religious landscape. And we're delighted to have the interview and delighted to pass over to Ben and Robert.
My guest today is Robert P. Jones, the founding CEO of PRRI and a leading scholar and commentator on religion, culture, and politics. He's the author of The End of White Christian America, 2 other books, and numerous peer-reviewed book chapters and articles. Dr. Jones serves as the co-chair of the National Steering Committee for the Religion and Politics section at the American Academy of Religion and is a past member of the editorial boards for the Journal of the American Academy of Religion and Politics and Religion, a journal of the American Political Science Association. He holds a PhD in religion from Emory University, an MDiv from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a BS in computing science and mathematics from Mississippi College. Today, we'll be discussing PRRI's 2018 reports about what's happening with the religious landscape in the United States. We'll look at the demographic changes in the country that might help explain the political climate that we find ourselves in today. Hello, Dr. Jones, and welcome to the Religious Studies Project. I'd like to begin by asking with a really broad question. What's happening with religion in the U.S. today?
Well, it's a great question. A lot is happening, and I think that is the story that we've been experiencing. Great deal of religious change, particularly since the 1990s, but even it's been accelerated in the last decade. So just to give you a couple of, I think, relevant stats. One is the percentage of white Christians in the country has been declining fairly precipitously in the last 10 years. And in particular, we've gone from, in the U.S., from being a majority white Christian nation to one that is no longer a majority white Christian nation. So, and it's happened fairly rapidly. If you go back to just 2008, the country was 54% white and Christian. And when I wrote my book, The End of White Christian America, I was working with 2014 data, and that number had dropped from 54% to 47%. And that was a significant drop. But we've been continuing to track data since 2014, and that number is down to 41% now. So we've looked at a 13 percentage point drop just since 2008. So over the last decade in the percentage of white Christians in the country. That's come with an uptick in the religiously unaffiliated category. So if you could just go back to the 1990s, those numbers are single digits, 5-6% in the 1990s. Our last data, 2017 data, is showing that number at 25% of the public. And among young people, it's 40% of the public. So this is a real sea change in the country, going from, mostly a white Protestant country. 1993 was actually the last year the country was white and Protestant. But even if you take all white Christians together, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox, non-denominational together, that number today is only 41%. And that's a real shift for the country.
Wow. I have a number of questions from that. One is this category of nones, N-O-N-E-S, the people who are unaffiliated. Many people think that that's a pretty homogenous category of atheists and agnostics, but from what I understand, that's not the case. Is that right?
That's right. Atheists and agnostics actually make up only a minority of that category, of a quarter of the U.S. population. And the rest of them are kind of a mixed bag. When we've looked underneath the hood, there's kind of 2 other groups in there. There's one group that looks that we've just broadly labeled secular in some of our reporting that looks broadly like a cross-section of the country. But there's another group in there that we actually dubbed Unattached Believers. And that group looks on many measures of religiosity, like how often do you pray? How often do you attend religious services? Do you believe in God? Those kinds of questions. They look like religious Americans, even though they refuse the category. They won't identify with any particular religious group. That group tends to be less white, more African American or Latino. They tend to be younger. And so it's a very interesting group. I think as a whole, this group has moved so fast now that it is a very diverse group. I mean, after all, it's a quarter of Americans. So that's a big group that we're talking about now.
Wow. And does that seem to be concentrated in the sort of godless coasts, or is that happening across the United States? Are we seeing a decrease in white Christian presence not only in the middle of the country, but also on the coast, or is it happening in certain places?
Yeah, this is a great question. This is definitely not a bicoastal urban phenomenon. In fact, one project that we at PRRI started back in 2013 is called the American Values Atlas. We actually have this online, for any of your listeners who want to go check it out. It's ava.prri.org. And what we did is we started realizing that we had enough data every year that if we were careful about combining it, we could actually map the religious demography of every state in the country and also the top 30 metro areas in the country. So you can go online right now and you can compare Iowa to California, and you can go back in time as well. And one of the things you see there is if you go back 10 years to today, virtually everywhere is experiencing these changes. So again, it's not just New York and California or Texas, but it's Iowa, Kansas, Minnesota. Each of these states have experienced, for example, approximately a 10 percentage point drop in the number of white Christians in their population over this last decade.
Wow. Are there any states or cities that jump out at you as sort of a surprising religious demography, or maybe the majority religious community is not what you'd expect, or the second biggest community is not what you'd expect?
Well, we still see some, history at play. I mean, we still see Rhode Island as one of the most Catholic, states in the country, for example. And we still see the South, heavily evangelical. So you can see the kind of religious history still there. But, it is starting to mix up, even though you can see these historic, centers, but you can also see the shifts happening there as well. So even in Rhode Island, you're getting an uptick in the religiously unaffiliated, more Protestants than you had in the past. And in the evangelical South, you're getting more Latino Protestants and Latino Catholics as a result of immigration and changing migration patterns in the South.
A few times already, you've mentioned the history of the United States. You've mentioned not only religious communities, but also mentioning markers of race and ethnicity, patterns of immigration. Can you tell me more about the relationship between religion, race, or ethnicity in the United States and how that shows up in the data?
Yeah. Well, it's one of the, when I was working on the last book, race, it became just so clear. I mean, it's something I've known, but I think it became clear to me in a more poignant way that, for example, if you ask me in a sentence to summarize religious voting patterns, you can't really talk about that without talking about race. So the short answer to that question is, in presidential elections, white Christians tend to favor Republican presidential candidates, and non-white religious people, Christians, and the religiously unaffiliated tend to support Democratic candidates. So the kind of lines of race and even class, to some extent, but the most dominant fault line in the religious landscape is really white, non-Hispanic Christians and pretty much everyone else. You can see this cleavage on a whole range of issues.
That's so interesting. I had a professor in graduate school who used to say that you could accurately predict Americans' voting patterns if you knew 4 R's: race, region, religion, and rank. And that's something that I've thought about a lot, this relationship between these 4 R's and how people vote and the embeddedness of religion in American culture. Are there religious communities that are more diverse in rank or race than others?
They are, but they tend to be the smaller ones. So like one of the more diverse groups in the country is Jehovah's Witnesses, for example. They tend to be very religiously diverse, very racially and ethnically diverse, much more so than really most other groups I can think of. But they, of course, are a very, very small, group in the country. But it is a story of American religion that race has sorted and bifurcated religious communities to such an extent that, you really can see these just major cleavages, both in denominational structure on the ground and the way that they're lived out and organized, but also in the, macro data. One of the reasons why, for example, social scientists, when we're kind of parsing data, tend to look at African American Protestants in one bucket and white evangelical Protestants in another bucket is because despite the fact that they share so many religious beliefs and practices, even hymns, when you look at how they behave and their attitudes in political space, the race kind of acts like a prism that just sort of pushes them in completely different directions. So it's hard to overstate, I think, the way that race has structured American religiosity.
That's so fascinating and brings me to another question, which is, as you know, religious studies as a field has had a lot of trouble with the quote unquote world religions paradigm and the fact that we often sort people into religious communities based on these large groups: Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus. And often when people teach about religion in schools or in the media, we expect people to act in certain ways or believe in certain ways based on the group that they fall in. Is the research that you're conducting showing that it's more complicated than that, or are there other ways that we should start thinking about religious identities so that we are not talking about these large world religions, but subsets based on race or ethnicity or gender or any other sort of categories?
Yeah. Well, here I think we've got the push and the pull of the quantitative versus the qualitative study of religion. In the social sciences, you need these categories. You need categories to sort people into, and they need to be big enough categories that you can actually conduct reliable statistical analysis on them, right? So if you're doing a survey of 1,000 people, you need these categories to be big enough to at least have, say, at least 100 or so people in them. Otherwise, your results start getting fairly unreliable if you drop below that. On the other hand, we all should just acknowledge that these are all sort of human, categories that have been constructed by social scientists to help us see things in certain ways. They're never perfect, and they always do some kind of violence, actually, to the kind of messy reality on the ground. We should always, I think, acknowledge, that thing. On the other hand, if we allowed for the uniqueness of every single congregation on the ground, which is, anyone who's ever served in a congregation knows that, like, if you move from one Southern Baptist congregation to another, it's a really different world, even though they're in the same, same denomination. If we stuck with that kind of granularity, which is really valuable, but it would be really hard to kind of come up and say anything broad about the group. So I think it is a real challenge. To me, what matters is, can you test the category against lived reality, right? And is the category? I think it's never the right question to say. For example, is the category of white evangelical Protestant, right, which has race, ethnicity, and kind of religious identity all baked into one thing. It's never the right question, I think, to say, is that a truthful category or is it like a right category? I think the question, honestly, is it a useful category for helping us understand the lived reality on the ground? That means it should never be sacrosanct. It should be questionable, and we should be willing to look at, for example, what do all evangelicals look like? If we don't just look at it by race, and then how does that category help us see, something interesting on the ground?
Right. I want to pause a moment on this topic, white evangelical Protestants. We began by talking about the religious demography of the United States. I mentioned that we might be able to see something about our political landscape because of the religious landscape. What do we know about the political landscape and the influence of white evangelical Protestants? Are we putting too much emphasis on white evangelical Protestants to understand our current political moment? Are there other groups we should be looking at? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. White evangelical Protestants, like other white Christians, have been declining in their percentage of the population. So, for example, if we go back again just to kind of the beginning of Barack Obama's tenure as president, 2008, his election, what we see is that white evangelicals, depending on the survey you look at, were around 23-22% of the population. And our last data has them down now to 15% of the population. So they, like other white Christians, have been declining as a proportion of the population. But what makes them important, even as they've declined, is that they have been so active on just one side of the partisan divide in the U.S. So unlike mainline Protestants or Catholics, who tend to be more divided in their partisan allegiances, even as this group has shrunk, they have still maintained their activity mostly on the Republican side of U.S. politics, which means that they have a very outsized voice on that side of the partisan divide, and not so much among Democratic politics, but among Republican politics. They are still a very powerful group to contend with if you're a Republican politician. So the other reason white evangelicals are important is because of their strong support for President Trump. They voted about 8 and 10 for him in the 2016 election. As we've been tracking their favorability of President Trump, it is around his inauguration, it was in about 2/3 favorable, and it has gone up since then and has remained fairly steady around 7 and 10 support for the president throughout his presidency. So that remarkable stability, I think, is also really important for understanding them as a stalwart base and in fact, when we asked white evangelicals who said that they had a favorable view of President Trump's job performance, whether there was anything he could do to lose their support, nearly 4 in 10 reported that no, there's virtually nothing President Trump could do to lose our support. So they are very, very entrenched, group in the Republican coalition, really bedrock support for President Trump.
Wow. That's interesting because on social media, I see this idea floated by a number of people based on mostly anecdotal evidence of young evangelicals that they've spoken to, that there's a generational gap and that older evangelicals are stalwart supporters of Trump, but that younger evangelicals might be moving away from that political affiliation, as well as certain key cornerstones of what many people think of as primary evangelical issues. Is that true? Is there a change in generation?
Well, I think there is that divide, but I think it's a little bit different than that description. So if we go back 10 years ago, I think that was more true than it is today. And but it is true that young evangelicals have moved, but where they have moved from is from being evangelical to being unaffiliated. So they've actually exited the category over time, and we can see that a couple of ways in the data. For example, among young people today, only 8% identify as white evangelical Protestant, right? And again, that's compared to about 15% in the population. So young people are only half as likely to identify as evangelical as Americans overall. And when we look underneath the hood and we look at the median age, for example, of white evangelicals over time, we see it creeping up. And the main reason for that is that as they've lost members, they're disproportionately losing members from their younger ranks. So what's happening is, yes, indeed, the young evangelicals of 10 years ago have moved, but they've not moved over to be Democrats, or they might have, but they've mostly moved out of the whole category. They've stopped identifying as evangelical. And I think that's the real shift. So if you're looking for those people who were young evangelicals a decade ago, you should look for them in the unaffiliated category and not in the evangelical category. And what we're seeing is that among the young people who have stayed, the generational differences are now kind of muted because the people who have stayed are actually people who hold views that are fairly consistent with older evangelicals. The ones who had views, for example, that were in great tension, like on gay rights, have largely left the fold.
Wow.
Sorry to interrupt the episode, but we just wanted to let you know, to remind you about our Patreon link. The Religious Studies Project has always been free since its inception, but we know that there's a great problem in academia with people not being paid for the work that they're expected to do, particularly early career scholars. And we at the RSP want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So you can help if you can spare even £1 a month by going to patreon.com/projectrs and subscribing. We know that these podcasts are very useful for people who are teaching and people in their learning. So if you can help either by subscribing there or by making a one-off donation using the PayPal button on our website, it would be greatly appreciated and will help us keep bringing you this podcast for free and fight against exploitation in academia. But now, back to the episode.
It's helpful to look at some of these assumptions or theories and test them against the data. So here's another thing to test against the data. I've heard a lot about the resurgence or higher visibility of progressive Christians in the United States today. And I know a lot of people are watching Reverend Barber's movement, for example. Does the data show increased religious affiliation or a higher salience of religious identity among people who identify as progressive Christians today?
Well, what I would say is it's a little complicated. The last sort of major study we did of this, where we looked at it very carefully, what we did see is among younger Americans under the age of 30, there were more progressive Christians than there were conservative Christians. That's true. It's largely true, though, because of this phenomenon we just talked about, right? Is that the ranks of evangelicals and other conservative, particularly white Christians, have thinned. And so as that has happened among the under 30s, the relative ratio between progressive and conservative Christians has kind of come more into balance. In fact, among those under 30, there are more progressive Christians than there are conservative Christians. However, there's one category that there is more than either of those categories, and that is the religiously unaffiliated,
Right.
because many, many young people 40% of young people are in that camp. Again, so it's notable, right, that's creeping up to be almost half of young people claiming no religious affiliation whatsoever. That's a really different thing, by the way, than we've ever seen in American public life. So if you take baby boomers back into their 20s, this is a question I get all the time, right?
Yeah.
Is like, well, isn't everyone more unaffiliated in their 20s, right? You're single, maybe you're moving around a lot, you're changing jobs, you don't have kids yet, maybe. So, those are all things that lead you to be more transient and less rooted maybe in a community or a community organization like a church or a synagogue or a mosque. But what we find is if we look at the historical data and we take baby boomers back into their 20s, they're still less than 15% unaffiliated in their 20s.
Wow.
So that means that this generation is at least 2.5 times more unaffiliated than any generation that we have ever seen. So even if some of them, quote unquote, come back as they have kids and they settle down, they're looking for kind of stability in communities and integrating into community life. Religious institutions are a way that people historically have done that. Even if a proportion of them do that, this will still be the most unaffiliated generation the country's ever seen.
What's quite interesting to me is when many people challenge the secularization thesis broadly, they often point to the United States as an outlier and say this is clearly a modern country that is highly religious and continues to be highly religious. So the secularization thesis is debunked.
Yeah.
Besides looking at other countries around the world that are highly religious. Does this data maybe put at least an asterisk by that and say, well, maybe we spoke a little too soon and the U.S. is actually becoming increasingly irreligious or unaffiliated? What does that do for our understanding of the secularization thesis?
Yeah, it's funny. We got a UK audience here, so
and United States. Both.
Yes, and US. But what's funny about this? When I give a talk in the US, and I say 25% of the country is now religiously unaffiliated, and 40% of young people are religiously unaffiliated, there are gasps in the room because people are shocked that there's that many people who claim no religious affiliation. If I gave that same lecture in London, people would be shocked that there were that many people affiliated, right? With religion. So I still think the U.S. is a little bit different than Western Europe, for example, which is where it mostly gets compared. There's still more religious vibrancy here, more religious experimentation, and more effervescence, I think, in the religious space than there is in Western Europe, for sure. And there's certainly not, I think, overall, I think politicians here, for example, still face pressure to say things like "God bless America" at the end of their speech in the way that British politicians certainly do not. If anything, they face the opposite, pressure not to say anything overtly religious like that. So I still think there's some difference here, but I do think that what we're seeing is there is a shift here that is certainly more, I think, of something in line with what we saw in secularization thesis. It's not an absolute outlier. It's certainly like a lagger from some of the trends we've seen in Western Europe. And I think we'll have to wait and see. I mean, so far, we don't see any evidence of this upward trend in the religiously unaffiliated flatlining. It keeps ticking up year after year after year.
I appreciate your cautiousness not to prognosticate. Is that the right word? But I'm going to ask you to make some predictions. Can you look out with your crystal ball 5, 10, 15 years? Are there any trends that you think will continue or things that you think we should look out for in the next decade or so?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is like the sort of financial retirement planning thing that you see at the bottom of the asterisk is past performance is no guarantee of, future returns.
Right.
I think that's kind of where we're at on this. But with that caveat, I will say the couple of pieces of evidence on just to continue the unaffiliated line here. We are seeing a couple of things that I think mean that this should continue, at least for the near future out. One is that we're seeing unaffiliated people now marrying other unaffiliated people, seeking them out as marriage partners. That's significant because one of the main things pulling people back into religious community, if they've become unaffiliated, is that they marry someone religious and they have that conversation like, okay, well, I'm not going to get married unless you pledge to raise the kids in the church or in the synagogue. And I think there's less and less of that happening. So I think that's one less thing to kind of pull people at least some people back into the fold. And, again, so far, we haven't seen a single year in the last decade where that line has been flat. It keeps upticking every year. One thing I'll say that is pretty clear from the evidence is that one of the reasons why this change on the ground has not quite translated into the political space yet is because of different ways that different religious groups turn out and vote. So in the U.S. context, the ballot box tends to act a bit like a time machine, and it takes us back about 10 years to where the country was about 10 years ago. So if you map the electorate onto the general population, the election in 2016 looks about like the general population looked in 2006.
Oh, okay.
It takes us back about 10 years.
Interesting.
And that's because white evangelicals and older white Christians turn out and vote at much higher rates. So they're overrepresented at the ballot box compared to where they are in the general population. And if we project that forward, what it means is even though we've passed this threshold, for example, where the country is no longer a majority white and Christian, that will not be true at the ballot box until 2024.
Wow.
So we're still 2 election cycles out from really seeing the demographic realities really hit at the ballot box.
Wow. Well, that's a great way to pause on the content of all the things that you've been finding. And I want to make sure we leave some time to talk about how you collect your data. Look behind the hood and look at the processes and how you set up your battery of questions. So could you tell us a little bit more about that? What's it like to run a major polling firm, and how do you do what you do?
Well, it's a lot of fun. First of all, it's great to be able to sit around a table and say, I wonder X, and think, well, that's an empirical question. We can actually put that to the test. So one of the things that we have at PRRI have pledged to do, so we're nonpartisan, we're nonprofit, independent research organization. So part of our charitable purpose is that we are actually putting a lot of social science data back into the public domain. So one of the things we have made sure that we do is that we are very transparent. So every time we release something, we release the full questionnaire. We hold on the data sets for a year for internal purposes and for analysis. But after that, we release the entire data set out into the public domain. So anyone can pull it up at the Roper Center. They can pull it off of our website and download and do their own analysis of the data. So that's part of our mission. In terms of how we collect it, we are dedicated really to doing full probability sampling of data. So all of our data is a random probability sample of the U.S. population. It's all Americans. So even though we have an emphasis on mostly doing kind of political party and religion and race and other kinds of demographic breaks, we have full balanced samples of the entire population and all of our surveys. We really do sit down and we do kind of our lit review process where we look at other polls and what they have asked and other trends we might want to check. But I think one of the things we are always trying to get at is the why question. And so not just the what, but the why. So we definitely want to know what people believe, but we also want to know what connects belief A with belief B and belief C. What's the underlying thing that people that drive them to connect those issues together? So that's, I think, is part of the art of this, and I think what makes it really the most fun and the most worthwhile.
It sounds so fun, in fact, that our listeners might be wondering how they can get involved. So do you have any ideas for scholars out there who sit there and wonder if X, Y, or Z about the American population? Are there ways for them to try to do polling or to reach out to your kinds of organizations to feed you ideas? Or what's the process if you're a scholar in a university for trying to find out some of this information at a national scale?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of options. I mean, I get emails all the time and I love getting emails all the time saying, hey, have you thought about this? And, every now and then there's like, oh man, that's a great idea. And we can, if we have space, we could do it. So I would say, feel free, to shoot us an email. We certainly are interested in hearing what's going on and ideas that are out there. The other way is we have formally partnered with a number of universities. So we were just this past year, we did past 3 years, we did a 3-wave study with Florida State University looking at spirituality and its impact on voluntarism and other kinds of pro-social behaviors, trying to answer the question, does it make a difference if you're religious or not for how you actually behave in the world? And trying to get at those kinds of questions. We partnered with the Brookings Institution, other kind of think tanks in this space. So I think it's a little of both. And we've done kind of individual individual things, but we've also worked on kind of careful and multi-year kind of full-on collaborations with academic institutions.
And your work is entirely focused in the United States, is that right?
It is, yeah. So we just do domestic kind of religion, politics, and culture.
And do you consult with folks outside the United States who might be interested in this kind of work in other countries, or do you have any partnerships or share ideas or best practices with organizations outside the U.S.?
Yeah. Well, we've certainly been talking about this. We haven't so far branched out beyond that, but it's certainly something, we'd certainly be open to doing. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for speaking with me today. I think this time really flew by for me. I enjoyed our conversation. I want to remind our listeners that you can download all of the reports from the Public Religion Research Institute, PRRI, at prrri.org. And if you're looking for contact information for folks at the organization, you can find that on their website. And we encourage you to check out the American Values Atlas Project, which has a lot of the data that we've been speaking about today. So thank you again, Robbie, for an excellent conversation. And I hope our listeners enjoyed it as well.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Robert and Ben. I talked a fair bit about the interview last week, so I don't want to repeat myself, but really good to go back to looking at North America. We had a wee run of this kind of stuff earlier on, and we haven't done any for a while, so that's great. But next week...
Yeah, from this week, you've had 4 blokes chatting. Next week, we've got a woman interviewing a woman. Fantastic. We've got Brianne Fallon, who's been speaking with Ruth Illman about basically music and Judaism. The title of the interview is Melodies of Change, Music and Progressive Judaism. So we're really looking forward to that interview. And that interview was actually suggested to us on Facebook by one of our Facebook followers, sent a message saying, I think it'd be great if you spoke to Ruth Illman about her research in contemporary Jewish music. And we said, we could probably do that.
Yeah, let's see if we can.
And it happened. So that is an example of just the sort of thing that you can do, listener.
So Brianne is in Australia, and is Ruth Illman in the US then?
I think she's in Northern Europe.
Ah, okay. So we're nice international spread.
Exactly. And it ties in as well because Brianne is currently working for a Jewish museum in Sydney, I believe.
Yes, she is.
So that it really tied in with her both academic interests and current professional interests.
And Brianne also had an article on the machete in Rwandan genocide and how it worked as a symbol on both sides in a recent issue of Implicit Religion. And we've just published 2 new issues of our journal, Implicit Religion. If you enjoyed Vivian's interview about Slenderman 2 weeks ago, you might want to check out her article there on mythology, video games as contemporary mythology. But there's also some interesting papers from the Open University conference that I was involved in organising, which I think will be of interest to our listeners.
We would hope so.
Yeah, well, there's 2 issues, so I'm struggling I don't want to pick one thing out. But go and check them out is the point.
Wonderful. So, listeners, we're into that sort of period of the year where everything's just ticking along nicely. I noticed that call for papers are out now for the BASR, of course, our beneficent sponsors. There's the AAR with Nasser have their own call for papers, our other beneficent sponsors.
EASR is coming up soon.
Yeah, and you should already be thinking towards things like IAHR 2020. There's a basic CFP up for that already. I can't believe how much the time flies. Every year, especially during this postdoc, I've said, I'll totally get to the AAR next year. But they're looking for abstracts in like a month for next November. And I don't think I'm going to make it.
But I can tell you that we will both be at the IAHR in 2020
Yes, we will.
in New Zealand.
Yes, we will.
And there will be a lot of RSP activity. That probably will be the conference with the most RSP activity ever.
Indeed. But in the meantime, we've got BSR at Leeds Trinity, and then David and I are jetting off to Hanover.
Yes.
For the German Association
Indeed.
Conference. And I'm sure we'll do some form of podcast there because we couldn't miss that. And I'll be in Rome with Tommy Coleman in May for the NSRN conference. And I'm sure there'll be other things too. So if you're going to something and you think, it'd be great if the RSP were covering it, maybe you could do that.
And we'll need to think about the Christmas special at the BASR again this year soon. It's all go.
Yeah, we'll be back. We'll be in September before we know it. But for now,
Thanks for listening.
The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The RSP is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SCO 47750.
Brought to you by founders and editors-in-chief Chris Cotter and David Robertson, and our managing editor Thomas J. Coleman III. Our features are edited by Jonathan Tuckett, and our Opportunities Digest by Ella Bock. Podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, with audio editing by Gregory Schneider and Samuel Ward. Social media managed by Ray Radford, and sales and marketing by Sammy Bishop.
Don't forget you can support the project by using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Google+, YouTube, iTunes and other portals.